Rick, you worked hard. You spent a lot of time at a company. You've had success, but at heart, you're an entrepreneur. So what do? You looked at laundromat businesses, vending machine businesses, real estate, but something keeps drawing you back to FedEx Linehaul, right? Right?
Yeah.
Whether it's the margins, not running after AR, being part of under the umbrella of Fortune 100 company, whatever it is, it brings you back. But it's a space you don't know. And so you're looking at deals, you're trying to figure out what's good, what's not good. And so the question is, you don't know what you don't know. So where do you start?
Help me.
Where do you go for help is the question. And so today we're going to attempt to, that's a good one. But today we're going to attempt to kind of drill down, find an answer, get ourselves to a place where we can answer the question of how do I know I'm getting a good deal? How do I have high confidence in that?
Yep.
And so first question I have for you, true or false? Valuing a business, there's only one way to do it.
That's widely false when we're talking about how people decide to come up with their valuations of a line haul business. That's for sure.
Good point. All right, let's jump into it. Let's bring in the big guns.
Hell yeah.
We have founder of Halditech, and I would say, the leader of the Dallas Linehaul Summit, fresh off of it, great events.
You can't say that. Oh my God.
What?
Ooh, Tim Goff's going to kick your ass.
Too much? I'm sorry. Let's bring him on. We have our guest, John Haldi.
Hey, John. Good morning. How are you, sir?
I got to agree with Rick and correct you, Christian.
Please.
Holbrook, Alex from Tim Goff, and we are absolutely a team of equals. They deserve full credit for the success of the Dallas Summit. I was just a bit player in that. And I think they would agree with me that the team that we put together this year, Brenna, Emma, Michelle, and Delaney, they get the lion's share of credit for making that happen. I mean, we had the vision, but they were executing. So I hate to start by correcting you, but that one had to be correct. I just was lucky to be there and to be a part of the show. It was phenomenal, and the team that put it together deserves all that credit.
To be fair, he gives the same intro to the other guys as well, just so you know. It was Dallas was great. Thank you, everyone who was able to put that together, including us. We had a phenomenal time, and it was number 2, right? It was building upon what was created, what you guys had all created a year ago, and it just went for me and us, in my opinion, as a contractor. It was more valuable, easier to access information. I thought that the way you guys had set up the information was easier to absorb and maybe kind of decide where you wanted to go. So I'm already looking forward to next year.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Always walk out of it very encouraged. So let's dive into today, because this is big. This is highly debatable. So let's dive into it. Let's try to add some value. And John, I want to kick this to you first. And I think the best way to approach this is to have a high-level discussion. And by way of an example, so John, let me ask you this. You are a prospective contractor, playing a scenario here. You have an opportunity, you're excited about getting to space. You have the opportunity to look at 2 dedicated solo runs running 6 days a week, 500 miles a day. How do you go about looking at this and figuring out whether or not what you're about to pay for it is a good deal or not? Can you walk me through what is your first thought? What questions are you asking, and who are you asking?
Yeah, I'd be happy to, but I'm going to put a slight twist on this. I don't have the skill set to honestly value a business. That's not what we do. I think I can provide some insight in this conversation on how you look at the revenue side and how you consider the expense side, and to drill down to a projected likely free cash flow number, which to me, for any business, is really the heart of it. How much money can you take out of the business as an owner, right? Whether someone wants to pay a certain multiple, I don't have my finger on the pulse of that. I'm not qualified to. Rick is much better person for that. But I'd love to talk about how you get to a number from which you then derive a multiple. Is that fair?
Very fair.
So, there's kind of 2 types of businesses at a super high level. Some businesses, you look at them and you say, we're not going to take cash out of it, but it's going to appreciate in value and we could exit with a multiple. And then there's other businesses that are all about cash flow. And I think that the TSP business lends itself more to that. Of course, you have an equity component that you're paying for with the routes, and in many cases the trucks if they come with it. But that's an equity. That's an asset side to it, and there may be some incremental appreciation as the market evolves. But I think it's mostly a cash flow business. Would you all agree to that?
100%, for sure.
I would agree. So let's break it down, right? We start at the top line, right? Can you walk us through when you're looking at this business, how do you approach getting to that top line figure?
So from a top line perspective, that's a question about revenue, right? And you have to look at the runs, because in this business, mix matters. I would argue that if you have poor runs that are not consistent, they're not predictable, they don't have a certain number of miles, you're always going to struggle to hit your targets from a cash flow perspective, because you can't predict the top line. So in your example, 2 assigned runs doing 500 miles a week, I love the story right there, right? Not 500 miles a week per day, because now you're talking 6 days a week. If that's 3,000 miles a week on a solo run, those are great numbers. You should be able to produce really good top line figures off of that run. You have to understand that with the fixed expenses associated with trucks and drivers and other things, and then the variable expenses that come with additional miles, there's balance. And for anybody who's not familiar with it, I'll tell you at simple terms, if you can make at the end of the day X amount of money with 3,000 miles a week, you don't make half as much money with 1,500 miles a week. There's a point at which you actually start to go into the red. Probably for a solo, I like to see 2,400 miles a week consistently. And then for a team, I like to see about 4,800 miles a week consistently, because when you get below those numbers, your margin starts to get significantly compressed. And if I see a solo truck that's getting 2,000 miles a week, I'm very worried that it's barely breaking even, if at all. There is an asterisk to that. If it's very short runs, which get paid more per mile, or there's a lot of spot work in there that's consistent, it could produce more revenue. But generally speaking, on the top level, you want that consistent number of miles. And I would say you could look beyond that and go to trip revenue, because of the variability in the length of the trips and how they pay you per mile. So it's a great proxy, miles per week. I think looking at the actual revenue per truck per week is a better.
All right, I'm going to hold you. Let's hold on, because this is a conversation that it's time to have. And let me go to his example. Christian is going to sell you 2 dedicated PM solo runs. They're doing 2,500 miles a week. According to what, Christian? Are you looking at the Schedule A and it's telling you that? Are you looking at settlement statements? Where are you saying that 2,500 miles a week is coming from, and how long are you verifying it?
Great point. So here's what I would say when I was approaching looking at a business is I would look at the A1, what it's scheduled for. I'd ask how it's running. If I can, I'm going to ask the manager how many days. You should have a pretty good sense of how many days it's going to be running, because it's a dedicated run. From that, you can look at your settlement statements. I pulled about 4 weeks and averaged it out, but I think maybe you guys have a different opinion of how many weeks you should be looking at. So curious to get your thoughts.
John, I think this is a question we spend a lot of time with. If I have that solo run and I lost a driver and it hasn't ran for 2 months, or my engine blew up on it and I haven't ran that dedicated run for 2 months because I wasn't able to, I'm about to lose it. And I say, oh man, you know what? I need to sell. So I package my business together, probably going to call Linehaul Solutions, obviously, because they're going to be able to help me out. But what are we using for the revenue for that run? We know the run ran for those 2 months, but that contractor doesn't have settlement statements to support the recent history of that run. How are you thinking mentally of utilizing that data for the revenue?
Well, I'm going to answer that in a minute, but let me back up and say this. Schedule A, you start with, what do you expect it to produce per week, right? Then you look at settlement history and you ask, is it doing what it's expected to do, right? Some runs, they do exactly as they're supposed to. Some runs pick up additional work because there's work available in the terminal. Some runs, they don't have the freight, and so they don't, even in a dedicated run, might not go every time. Equipment issues could impact the consistency of whether you get the miles you expect. Driver issues could impact that, right? overall freight could. So to Christian's point, I would say 4 weeks, not nearly enough, in my opinion. It's too easy for a seller to cherry pick a 4-week window. I tell anybody, get a year's worth and then start there and look to see if there's a pattern of consistency that validates the Schedule A, right? Now, you can do it by hand. There are various folks who have software in the space. We have it, other folks do. You don't have to use us, but find tools that would make your life easy, even if it's just Excel, and put the story together. This is the due diligence part of buying any business, right? You want to validate that what you're being told actually is supported by the data behind it. And the settlements are your primary source for that when it comes to how many miles and how much revenue are you getting. Does that make sense?
It does. And so let me kind of keep going down this. We'll structure it as of a P&L, right? So we talked about your revenue where we could look at your historicals. We'll pull a year's worth of data. We can get an idea of the first expense item, let's say fuel, right, from our settlements. Do we care about what another contractor does for the rest of their expenses? Do you consider what they've been doing, or do you look at industry averages, call up vendors? How do you value what that business can make you?
I think if you're doing your due diligence properly, you have to look at both, right? Because you can look at industry averages and you can say, what should my expected end free cash flow be? What can I take out of this business? And I think that the industry averages give you a starting point for what you should expect to see when you look at the actuals. And then you can compare the actuals against what you expected. And if they're wildly different than what you expect, I think as part of good hygiene for doing an acquisition, you have to dig in and understand why are they different. At the simplest level, if you have an operator who's lousy at running their business, this could be a great value add opportunity if you're good at running your business, right? You could boost the P&L from what they're claiming. On the flip side, looking at actuals versus expected can illustrate to you that maybe they're in a really tough market for hiring. Maybe they have to pay very, very high amounts to get drivers in that market. Or maybe they're in a great market. Maybe drivers are plentiful and cheap, right? Similarly for fuel, are they running in mountainous regions and it's really hard to stay fuel efficient? And are they losing money on fuel? Are they in Florida with great weather and lots of empty trailers and lots of flat roads and they get great mileage? The major buckets that I think of: fuel, drivers, equipment, and management. Those are the 4 big expense lines. Everything kind of falls into those buckets. So I think you're right, Christian. You look at what they're telling you, and then you sanity check it on what the rest of the industry is doing. And when it's at cross purposes, it's not in the middle of the bell curve, you need to ask why. And is it something you as a buyer could fix, or are you inheriting a problem that's going to stay with you, and that has to adjust your expectations?
Right. And I want to drill a little deeper there into how we get there, right? Because we're talking about two kind of aspects here: the technical side of valuing a business, which is what we're touching on, where you get the data, and then there's the fundamental side, right, where you look at growth and opportunities. So we'll put that aside for now. But the technical side, how do we get to those values? If, say, I'm approaching a contractor, I don't know what their accounting practices are. I don't necessarily know if they're good, and maybe they haven't been operating long enough to have good enough data. So yes, it's good to look at, but is it fair enough to say you don't necessarily need it, because you can produce a good summary of what a business can do for you or has been doing by going into MyGroundBiz and then applying those averages, or applying, maybe reaching out to a John Haldi and saying, hey, what do these expenses look like?
I think you're right. I think that the industry standard in terms of the quality of their accounting, their bookkeeping, their financial reporting, it could be a lot better across most TSPs. And I wouldn't be surprised to see a bias in somebody selling, that most of them are selling because they're not tracking that stuff well. They don't have good data. So, option one is you want to roll up your sleeves and take as much hard data as you can and try to do a forensic reconstruction of a valid P&L. Maybe that's not worth the time and effort. So at that point, option 2 is take the industry averages. And then I would say, go do your homework. As far as drivers go, there are plenty of recruiters who are offering free services in terms of helping you know what the market is like for a given geography. Are you going to expect to pay more? Are you going to expect to pay less? I think from an equipment standpoint, there are different vendors in the leasing and the sales side, and you can use your common sense. It's very different to operate in flats with good weather as opposed to lousy weather or colder weather, or mountainous regions. You could look at that and make some presumptions on what your equipment costs might be and your breakdown costs. So I think it's a messy mix of this, and you have to use your judgment and do your homework. Certainly talking to as many people as you can and learning as much as you can about this space is to your benefit, right? Because there's a lot of people at the shows, online, networking, use your Rolodex, vendors. Take advantage of all these resources so that you can make as informed a decision as possible about predicting what you're going to take out of the business.
2013, I first started looking at BizQuest to buy some FedEx runs. Figured out very quickly P&D wasn't for me. Linehaul, man, that could be a place that I could flourish, part-time side hustle while I do my regular job. The narrative hasn't changed very much in terms of what people think about our space. I remember looking and talking to brokers and people selling and getting data dumped almost with just information, and that to me today, this version of me, not relative at all. But the one thing that I was so frustrated with, and what really is leading to this conversation many years later, is the way that people calculate their numbers is just very different. Some cases, you get tax returns and then it's averaged out, and they're building their data, their EBITDA off of tax returns. In other cases, they're building them off settlement statements and what the run could do or not do, and you have zero sense of consistency. And I'm not talking about in terms of pricing, I'm just talking about in terms of the numbers that are being presented. Is there a way to get the industry standardized in terms of what we use? And I say we, but more of what you, being a leader in terms of analyzing and with the data and what you have access to, is there a way to standardize this so that people, at least when we're looking at an ad for a business for sale, or a contractor wants to sell another business to another contractor, they can say, hey, here's what the run does, and we know what we're talking about?
Well, I don't think you can do that by edict or by regulation, but I think that market forces can push it in the correct direction. If buyers start becoming intolerant of crappy books, right? If buyers start becoming intolerant of fluff and pro formas that don't hold water, I think it's going to force the industry to get better at it, for the simple reason that if you take someone trying to sell something and they're saying it's going to make X amount of money, and you have a community of buyers who are going, well, how do you justify that? And most of them are calling BS because they can't justify it. The sellers are going to have to start getting more sophisticated about documenting things if they want to get full price, because hopefully the buyer community is saying, I don't believe your numbers, so I'm going to discount them by 50%, and I'll base my decision based on that discounted pro forma. So the better the numbers get, hopefully the more the buyers believe them and the more they can base a decision on that. They don't have to discount as much. So I think that there's market forces that can do this. I think that when you look at brokerage generally, whether it's real estate or other things, there's always a desire to sell for the highest price because that's how you attract your brokerage customers. But I think that the buyer community has to stop being stupid, right? They have to start demanding better information, more accurate information. I think that they need to work with people like you, Rick, who are demanding these things. And I think that long term, it's going to evolve in the right direction if buyers do that.
Agree. And I agree kind of more with more emphasis than I can share right now. How important are tax returns? Why do I care about tax returns? Or should I? And that was a load. I basically told you my opinion in the way that I asked the question, but tell me, John, how important are tax returns?
So I think they're important. I think if you're going to do proper due diligence, besides settlements, besides P&Ls, I think you have to go further, because what you're trying to do is spot check to make sure you're not being told a load of BS, right? So I'll come to tax returns. One of the other things that you should think about is asking for 12 months worth of bank statements for the company. Make sure that the money going in and the money going out makes sense, and ask a lot of questions about them. Go back once you've reviewed them. Say, what's this money going to? Okay, that's you taking money out of the business. What are all these other expenses? And maybe it's some fuzzy stuff like they wanted to have a company car in the business because it's more beneficial tax-wise. You can earmark those and take them out. But if they're actual driver pay stubs, which you should ask for also, like history of weekly payroll, doesn't match what they're telling you they pay for drivers, the bank statements will validate that. This is how much money going out for payroll, those kinds of things. Where tax returns are important is, again, validating the story that you're being told, making sure you're not being lied to, or they're not fluffing it around the edges, right? Where you can get into a mess with this in this business is depreciation. Because for people who buy trucks, they have the ability to time the placement of the depreciation using accelerated and bonus depreciation. So if they choose to, they can take depreciation today and show no profit on the books, even though they're taking cash out of the business. And the tax return is going to show they made no money. But similarly, if they've taken it or they choose to defer it, they can look a lot more profitable on the tax returns. So again, you have to look at all the different pieces and assemble them to understand what's happening, because depreciation is a huge part of the P&L, and they can control whether it's this year, next year, last year, whatever. So you have to take it with a grain of salt and make sure you get a credible story from them about how depreciation could be impacting the returns.
It's a very important point. I do want to ask this because we're talking about the revenue number and then going from there. Do you place as much of a value on unassigned and spot runs? And in that, it almost seems like I answered the question, but I suppose what I'm getting at is, how much of a difference do you value unassigned and spot runs?
The answer is it depends. Okay. During the COVID boom time, you saw unassigned runs, solo runs, getting 3,500 miles a week because they needed every truck and driver they could get at all times. When the boom time ended, a lot of people who had unassigned runs and thought this is as good as assigned, I don't understand the difference, suddenly found out the difference because FedEx was in a position of overcapacity. And when there's overcapacity, unassigned runs are the first ones to fall off the table. And if you remember what I said, you want to, the core of a good TSP business is consistency and predictability on your miles and revenue. And if you have runs that aren't going consistently, you are in this horrible spot where the fixed costs, they keep coming every week. You still got to pay for the truck, the insurance, all the things associated with it. And you still probably have to pay for the driver unless you're willing to let them go and eat the cost of recruiting. And, if it's a case where the run's are not going to go for 3 months, well, great, you can make some changes. But unassigned runs tend to be the kind of thing where, hey, we don't need you Tuesday and we don't need you Friday. But you got a driver who's expecting to make a certain amount of money. So now you're in the ballgame of talking about minimums. So it can eat you alive to have runs that aren't consistently going. So yes, if I was buying, if in your example, if those were 2 unassigned runs, I would definitely apply a discount. The question of how much depends entirely on what has it been doing for the last 12 months? How inconsistent is it? And it also depends on my prediction of how much overcapacity or undercapacity is FedEx going to have in the near term or long-term future. So I think a discount applies to those things, but it's really dependent on the situation. If somebody's got spots they run consistently every day, 5 days a week, that's a very different story than, hey, I occasionally pick up a spot run to Chewy every now and then. So it's hard to answer with a definite number, Christian.
No, and I think that's what we're getting to, which is there may not be a correct answer necessarily, but it's, where do you find the highest confidence in acquiring that business? Because if they have been running consistently and you can show that through the historical settlement statements, then you should have a high degree of confidence that you can continue doing that. It is possible that a contractor really hustled, but with a long enough time frame, it should give you confidence that you can potentially repeat that. And there is a value on that unassigned run or those spot runs. So I think what you said is fair.
But remember, past performance is no indication of future. We're in a very interesting time where we had COVID, then we had an economic slowdown, which impacted the overall freight economy. And now you've got a period with one FedEx that some people, myself included, are predicting is probably going to be a period of incredible growth and expansion and under capacity on the growth on the ground side. And so I think that 6 months ago, I took a dim view of someone trying to pay a lot to acquire lots of spots or lots of unassigned runs. But when I look at right now, with the consolidation of FedEx, the potential for them to move some of those full trailers to ground from freight and express, and I combine that with the potential in the short term of UPS going on strike, Yellow maybe going bankrupt, and I think, wow, FedEx is in the catbird seat that they may very well have a ton of freight that they're not prepared to handle, and that should be a huge boom time for the ground folks. So it depends not only on what the contractor's done historically, but your own prediction of macroeconomic factors that are affecting the market and how confident you are as to whether or not the unassigned runs are going to get full use or partial use, or whether they're going to be more demand, who knows? So there's no one size fits all answer to that.
And that's unfortunate because we're really looking for a concrete answer, John. So you'd be so kind. Well, it's something you
Let me offer you some concrete thoughts because we've touched on it, okay?
Mhm.
I'm very distressed that selling brokers love to obsess about gross revenue. And I think very concrete, that's not the number to focus on. And the reason I don't like that is, in your example, Christian, if you have 2 assigned solos, in the last 6 months, they have been grossing, or 12 months, they've been grossing, what would be a good number to use here? 250,000 a year. Okay, each run. So 500,000 total. Fuel is at $3.50. Something happens next week in the Mideast, and fuel goes to $6 a gallon. Okay. Those runs do the exact same number of miles for the next 12 months. Selling brokers would love to advertise, oh my God, look at this business. Their gross revenue went up 25% in the last 12 months. The underlying business hasn't changed. The gross top line has, because fuel costs more. And I hate using multiples of gross unless you're adjusting the multiple based on the market dynamic of fuel price, which doesn't happen. So there's a concrete answer for you. Don't use gross.
Two things, and I want to get into your. And I watched your interview that you and Dave did recently. I didn't get to see it at the summit, but I watched your YouTube. Phenomenal for anybody who hasn't seen it. But you talk about the way that you kind of analyze the data and you take fuel out, which I think is extremely interesting. As everybody should know, our revenue is correlated to the price of fuel. So as fuel goes up, we pay more at the pump. We're also getting more revenue. And the reverse is also true. And from somebody who's, also been in the trucking industry, sometimes you can become a slave to fuel. And the good thing about FedEx, one of the benefits is I don't believe that FedEx contractors are as overly obsessed with the price of fuel that typical trucking companies will be, because of that system that they've integrated into our settlement statements.
Can I add some color on that for folks watching?
Yeah, for sure.
For a freight company, when they are trying to move things, there's this risk of fuel price movements. Fuel comes down, could be good. Fuel goes up, could be bad. Who bears the risk? From a TSP's perspective, FedEx bears the risk. They reimburse you each week based on the average price you paid for fuel for each truck. So if fuel's going up, you're not taking it on the chin. If fuel's going down, you're not making a windfall. So FedEx is dealing with that. And I'm not sure how they pass it on to customers or if they do, but as a TSP, for the most part, they mute that. There are some little games you can play on the edge because they have to figure out how to pay you. And if you can do better than their assumed MPG, you can make money. And if you're doing worse, you lose money. But fuel up or down doesn't really matter to you as a TSP. It shouldn't.
Kind of want to get to our opinion about that. But when we look at post-pandemic FedEx Linehaul, we saw volatile fuel prices. I mean, it was low. May of 2021, I believe, it was just insanely low. And then, it may have been 2020, obviously, but and then it skyrocketed. And so as a contractor, our revenue just went, from lows to highs. And I wouldn't say we were overly concerned with it just because of the way the system works. But when we're looking at the revenue of these businesses, obviously, if someone's selling you a business based on the revenue, it was just such an outlier towards the median when we're looking at a longer period of time. And so all that to say is, when we're trying to come up with the revenue of these businesses, and especially of runs that may, certainly aren't consistent, and we had a very aggressive time, and then all of a sudden in 2023 we have, lows in terms of volume, what should we consider? You have to start with the revenue. You have to start somewhere. So how are we explaining to a potential, new contractor that the revenue that they expected is very different, and how long should we be including in that? Or how long would you suggest using in a look back period when we have fuel prices that were so off base? And when we do consider the fuel prices, when we're trying to predict a line item for fuel, what do you suggest we use? Flat percentage based on industry averages, or are we using the actual fuel listed on the settlement that, Halditech makes it easy for us to figure out what that is?
Well, this goes back to the whole thing, which is, and you talk about a great period with fuel prices where not only were they moving wildly, but they were moving quickly. Like week to week, you saw wild swings, like by $1 in diesel prices because of the gyrations on Wall Street, commodity traders, and world news about fuel and strife in fuel producing regions and that kind of stuff. It goes back to what I said. Your goal in doing the due diligence to acquire a business is, how can you make the most reasonable, informed prediction of what your P&L is going to look like? And if you acknowledge the fact that FedEx, for the most part, takes fuel out of it, I think the most reasonable thing to anchor on is, how do I take the fuel out of the gross revenue completely and look at what's left? We call it trip revenue. Other people have their own metrics for this. But what's left after fuel, how do I predict that? Because if the miles are consistent, it should be an extremely consistent number. If it's an unassigned run and the miles are not consistent, maybe it's not a consistent number. But if you can take if you can get to what we call trip revenue, which is literally gross minus all the fuel reimbursement, boom, now you're off to the races and you can do things. Now, we like to do some gyrations, which we talked about in that video, which is to move fuel expense up to COGS, right? Which gives you a gross profit that takes revenue, trip revenue, and fuel expense out. And now you have an extremely stable number, because if you leave fuel expense down below, your actual revenue is going to change a little bit. So you want to try to just be as informed as you can and predict what your P&L is going to look like, right?
Good point. Which now I think it's a good time for us to talk about the other side, the fundamental side. If it's good with you guys, switch over and talk about valuations and fundamental analysis, right? And I want to start it by asking one question, which is I get very often from prospective new contractors, which is, the contract is an annual contract. Should I be worried that this will be taken away? And should that reduce, therefore, maybe the multiple or the value I place on acquiring this business? Should there be any concern there?
The answer is hell yes, you should be worried about it. So here's the thing. It's an annual contract. FedEx doesn't want to be capricious or do things on a whim. That's not to the benefit of the network. They don't operate that way. And I'll give you a point of comparison just to step back. If I come to you, Christian, and I say, I've got a strip center with 10 retail bays in it, it's producing 100,000 of free cash flow at the end of the day, NOI, right? Net operating income, I should say, not free cash flow, and net NOI. You'll pay some multiple, maybe 10 times that for the strip mall. You'll give me $1 million for it. But here's the thing. It's a physical hard asset. I can insure against catastrophic loss, fire, flood, or any other things. I can get whole if I buy that from you and something happens to make it go away. Routes, which are your asset that produces this money, there are reasons that they can go away. Some of them you can control. For example, if you have a lousy safety score, they can take it away. If you have lousy performance in terms of points and declines in your ability to have a driver and a truck ready when they need it, they can take it away. If you cross an ethical line, they can take it away. If this is where it gets really ugly, if FedEx loses a massive customer in your geographic patch and they lose the freight, well, they don't need the run anymore and they can take it away. Technically, they don't have to make you whole. Your routes can just go away. So there has to be a discount applied to that in your mind. But understand, they don't want to do that. They do it very cautiously because it sends shockwaves through the whole network when it happens. And my experience has been when it happens through no fault of your own, but because they lost customers, they'll work hard to try to make it up to you by giving you different runs, but it may take a while. They may not have the runs to give you. So my answer is, hell yes, you got to discount it when you compare it to a hard asset class like something like real estate.
Mm-hmm. And that's why when people talk about multiples that get above 4-5x range, or even including those, it's always like, well, I don't know if we're ever going to be able to achieve those with the current state of the contract. The FedEx model would need to be adjusted. The TSP would have to be to reach those higher multiples in terms of where we're going to get to, as an industry. And I think for me, that's fine. It's I can build a business and I can grow a business and I can provide value and add to it. And when I'm ready to sell out a 3x, you can do very nicely with a business that you've ran successfully. And so when we talk about the multiples specifically, John, and I know, you don't get as involved, but for us, how much these businesses are worth and trying to pin down a value we spend most of our time with. Do you like to talk about the multiples in terms of what people should be paying at all as part of your analysis?
Well, I'll offer these thoughts without putting a specific number. Well, maybe I will put a specific number. I came from the finance and real estate space before I got into this, so I'm going to go back to that. One of the things that absolutely impacts multiples is interest rates. They're absolutely correlated. So when interest rates are low, because most people finance these businesses, that means that people will typically pay a higher multiple, okay? Because they can get financing cheaper. So when they work through the spreadsheet and they think about how much cash has to go towards interest and principal and those things, they can afford out of the free cash flow to pay more for their financing. So interest rates go up, multiples in any market have to come down. So take that as a given and understand that it's cyclical and it's tied to interest rates. And the last 15 years are the biggest low interest rate environment we've ever seen. So historical multiples have been higher than they've ever been in every business that is a financed business, okay? So as interest rates have gone up, I would expect multiples to come in. You know better than I whether they have, right? From a sanity standpoint, though, if you have a business you can take 100,000 out of, right, and you pay a certain multiple, you can go back and say, well, how many years does it take me to pay off the debt to do this thing? And real estate's the kind of thing where you historically see multiples that are extremely high, and that's because it's financed, it's low touch, you can do them in scale, they're very consistent, and there's very little risk of a catastrophic loss. You just have economic cycles and interest rate cycles. This business, like we said, you have to discount the routes for the possibility that they just go away through your own fault or no fault of your own. You have to factor in the interest rate costs. Pre-COVID, the market for TSP routes, in my mind, the fair value market where most things traded was like 3 times.
And that included trucks or not trucks?
You have to break it out. Trucks is its own thing. When you look to buy something with trucks, you need to ask, how much am I paying for the routes? And then you look at how much am I paying for the equipment. And the equipment should be a very simple sort of Kelly Blue Book exercise of what are the trucks really worth? oh, you think they're worth 500 grand? I'm hearing they're worth 400 grand. Let's find a number in the middle and let's move on. But the routes from a multiple standpoint, this is what I'm talking about. And so if a solo route was producing 20,000 in free cash flow pre-COVID, pre lots of brokers getting into the space, the market felt like at the time a 20,000 a year free cash flow route would generate $60,000-$70,000 on the sale. And now we've seen much higher numbers historically. And there was demand to get into the space. There was low interest rates. FedEx was booming. Shipping was booming when everybody else was out of work. So, supply demand came into it. I don't know where it's going to settle out. I don't know if FedEx really is going to go through a massive growth phase on the TSP side. I think that's going to depress these multiples. I think if FedEx is giving away free routes like candy, mints at a diner at the end of your meal, why would you pay $100,000, $150,000 for a route over here when you could go on Build a Ground Biz and get something free? So there's going to be a cycle, right? And maybe we're heading to a down cycle on the multiples. It's hard to say, but back to the point, don't ever pay for a multiple of gross unless you're doing all the gyrations to figure out how to adjust for. You've got things like fuel in there that shouldn't be in there.
And I asked a question related to trucks, and just from my perspective, 2017, 18, it was 3X with a truck included. There was you got the truck with that, and you didn't see as many leased trucks out there as part of the deal. There was no REL, Penske and Ryder. It just wasn't as prevalent in the deals. And then now, kind of the 19, 20, 21, it was 3X independent of the trucks. And then now it could be 4 or 5X just based on with or without the trucks. And I think it's important to remember, and we try to preach constantly, is that not all runs are created equal. I think there's runs that demand a 5X multiple in our marketplace. And that is the we call them, the white whales, 550 plus miles, 6 or 7 days a week, AM solo dedicated runs. The runs that everybody wants, they're easy to own, easy to operate. You won't have to put much effort into it, and the money is going to be there. And you're never going to need to upgrade that run. You want more of those runs. And we see less of them as the hours of service have reduced the mileage on the FedEx runs. There's not as many of those out there anymore. And that's very different from your dedicated PM run doing 320 miles a night, 5 days a week, that may or may not have some spots attached to it. So inherently, in my opinion, when we're trying to value the business, if we're pairing those runs together, those are two very different multiples, even within that same sale, of how we're trying to evaluate that process. And I think that's a conversation that I'd love to lead, and I'm trying, to push the market towards that and saying, hey, there's not a flat multiple that we should be paying. It's more based on how, and it could be correlated to the demand of the run. Who wants these? Contractors want these. Are they willing to pay a significantly higher price for them comparatively? Or is it one that we have to go to new contractors because no contractor is going to want to touch it for any amount of money, and why? So I think the one thing, we would love your help with is determining the numbers that we're using to give to people in terms of a more technical amount of that data.
Well, let me put some color on what you just said, because I do agree with you. When you have the white whale, right? Mm-hmm. I think when you look at the numbers, what happens is it plays out like this. A solo run that gets 2,500 miles a week is going to produce ballpark trip revenue, 200,000 a year. Let's just take that as an example. A white whale doing 3,500 miles a week is going to do more like $280,000, $300,000 a year. And you go, well, it's a higher multiple because of all the revenue. But what actually happens is the white whale is much, much more profitable
than
the regular one. And so I think when you actually look at the end free cash flow that you could expect to take out of it, the multiples are closer in line than you would think if you're looking at the multiple of that. But when you look at the multiple of revenue, it's a higher multiple of the white whale because it's so much more profitable. So let's make up a story here. The 200,000 in trip revenue produces 20,000 in profit. The 300,000 in trip revenue produces 45,000 in profit, right?
Yep.
And so when you do the ratios, you find out that when you look at the profit, the multiples are not that far out of whack. But when you look at the revenue, you think, my God, I'm paying so much more for the white whale. Does that make sense?
It makes complete sense. And we're seeing it every day. The difference in the runs and the quality of the runs and the multiple that we're kind of our customers and what we even to a certain extent expect off of those runs. John, there's 20 things that I didn't get to on my notes that we needed to talk about. But as always,
sorry, I got notes.
This is a conversation. Linehaul Solutions in the summer, leading into the fall of 2023, this is the conversation we're having. We're having it with you. We're having it with everybody. I believe we're going to circle back around to you very soon and maybe get your opinion as we almost try to walk down this journey. Me personally, it's something that I'm extremely invested in. I want to know that the values that people's business they're getting into, they're justified, and create a system where whatever I am talking about, whoever I'm talking to, there's a sense of understanding that the numbers are the same. And it's impossible. We'll never get there, but I'll do my best to kind of push everybody in speaking the same line haul vernacular when it comes to evaluating, but even determining net income, EBITDA, the numbers we all use, but they're very different from business to business.
Well, Rick, I am delighted that you're leading the effort to shed light on these topics and to educate folks. I think it's super important that everybody thinking about getting into the space or anybody in the space really understands how these numbers interplay with each other and how to value these things. And I thank you for letting me be a part of the conversation, and I love to continue to be a part of it. I think what you're doing is super healthy for the whole community.
For sure. Same to you. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful week. I'm sure we'll talk about this probably very soon.
Thank you, John.
Christian, Rick, thank you for having me on here. It's been a pleasure. Look forward to next time.
Same. All right, guys. Have a good one.